I'm Corleen Kraft, president of the club, and welcome our guest today, Congressman Earl Blumenauer, who will be talking about assessing tsunami relief efforts in Southeast Asia. Just a few brief announcements before we get to Congressman Blumenauer's presentation. If any of you have neglected to turn off your cell phones or things that go bump in the night, please take care of that at the moment. A few announcements, and I would like to mention, since I'll go through the announcements briefly, that all of the announcements that I'm making, the text of which can be found in your bulletin or online at pdxcityclub.org. You can also find membership information there, and you can buy audio or videotapes off our site. I want to mention next Friday's forum on March 4th, and that's going to be featuring Marie Smith, who is the national president of AARP. She's going to be speaking on strengthening Social Security, why private accounts are a public issue. It should be very interesting. I think most of us know AARP's position by now, but we'll see. Some club activities coming up. Today is the final Friday of the month, and we'll be continuing with our series of Final Friday get-togethers across the street at the club on 9th and Washington. Just get together for some chatting with members, a little bite to eat, a little bit to drink, and just enjoy a little convivial afternoon. On Monday, our book club will meet at the club at 7:15, I believe, and Citizens Read is co-sponsored by Portland Streetcar. Next week, our issue committees begin their round of March meetings. And next month, on March 9th, there's a special City Club presentation performance of The Visit by the Sojourn Theater at Marshall High School. It will be followed by a post-performance discussion with the cast and the artistic staff, and the tickets for that are $12. You can get them by calling the club office. It should be a very special event and just one of our ways of reaching out to different kinds of activities to meet more needs of our ever-growing membership. Speaking of which, our annual membership drive is underway and will continue until June 3rd. All new members who join in February and March will have the opportunity to have their names entered in a drawing that has been contributed by Thomas Lauderdale of Pink Martini fame. And if you know Tom, he's a very interesting character, and this Oregon memorabilia package that he's put together is very interesting as well. It contains several signed Pink Martini CDs and books from Oregon authors, as well as a vintage Viewmaster from Viewmaster with slides of Oregon tourist sites. So it should be interesting. So you can join today before you leave back here, or join online. Our sponsors this quarter, for whom we are very grateful because they subsidize our broadcasts, are Nike, Portland General Electric, and Preston Gates and Ellis, LLP. And now we'll move on to our presentation. I would like to mention for the radio audience, which is rather more vast than the number of people that we have in here today, that Congressman Blumenauer will be doing a slideshow, and so he is going to make every effort to put enough narrative with it that it will be logical to the listeners. But to you listeners out there, I would say go online, pdxcityclub.org, and you can get video, and that might even be more interesting for you. Now, Congressman Blumenauer is affectionately known as Earl. I understand that last week, Senator Peter Courtney asked Doug Marker, who was taking over for me, to introduce him as just Peter. And with no disrespect to Senator Courtney, I think just Peter to the radio audience was probably not as apparent as it would be if I introduced this fellow as just Earl. Because there are certain names like Vera and Earl that we immediately associate with the person. And I think that's in large part due to the fact that Earl has devoted most of his career, well, in fact, his entire career, to public service. He first served in the House of Representatives in 1972, and then went on to be a Multnomah County Commissioner, and after that spent 10 years on the Portland City Council. He's represented Oregon's 3rd Congressional District since 1996, and he currently serves on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and also as a member of the International Relations Committee. And he's won numerous awards for environmental education, community, and civic organizations, including the 1999 Legislator of the Year from the American Planning Association. So please welcome Earl.
Thanks, Corleen, and for all of you who are not so fortunate as to have your name associated with you. It's probably not too late to think about adjustments that you want to make to correct that. I always thought that if I had another child, I would name him or her re-elect to give a little bit of a head start to them. I appreciate the opportunity to have a chance to discuss with you today an experience that was very profound for me. And I will touch briefly on some slides, but most of what I want to engage in will not be locked up in pictures because one can be caught up in that. And frankly, what came across for me spending 12 days in the Tsunami region is a sense of how we as a community take meaning and direction from these horrible events. On December 26th of last year, we had at 7:58 a.m. local time a unique global disaster. It was not just the largest earthquake that the Earth had experienced in 40 years. It unleashed a giant wave of destruction moving at speeds of 500 miles an hour in open seas. 15 minutes from the epicenter, it hit Banda Aceh. An hour and a half later in Thailand. 7 hours later, the effects of the tsunami killed people on the African continent. The North Pole shifted an inch, and scientists tell us that the length of a day is permanently shortened, although 2.68 microseconds. I'm not sure that that's going to make a difference in planning my day, but it does give a sense of the power. But what was unique was not so much the devastation and the loss of life. Now we think approaching 300,000 people killed and missing. But it was the world watching these events on CNN, not just in the 11 countries where the devastation occurred, but having an impact on countries around the world with the many visitors in places like Phuket in Thailand. It was something that unfolded in time. It affected so many people that I think it was the first disaster on that dimension that had a chance to engage us in ways that I think is going to have some effects in the long run, at least that I hope they will. I had the opportunity to begin as a member of the International Relations Committee, as Carleen mentioned. We had a delegation to look at the impact, look at the efforts the United States was making to convey to countries, frankly, that have, in some instances, some rocky relationships with the United States, reconvey our interest and our concern. Frankly, it is very difficult to capture in words. I will say that these images will remain with me for a lifetime. And I did want to show a few of the 1,000 pictures that I have here. Mercifully, we will go through this in short order Okay, Neil, I've got it on high. I'm pushing the big button. And there's a map, all right. Started in Shanghai, meeting with representatives of the Chinese government, NGOs, academics. It was part of a group that we had put together earlier, but it was interesting using that as a jumping off point, dealing with the Chinese, and ending a week and a half later in India after having visited Indonesia, Cambodia, and Sri Lanka. You're going to hit, go ahead, Neil. Let's just flip through. Part of what was astounding was the scale of the damage. From a distance, you were coming in this case, to Aceh from a helicopter, and there was this thin band of brown in the background, and as you grew closer, it was clear that this was an area where all the vegetation had been scraped away. And the scale again here on this slide, this is a massive barge and a tugboat, and it gives you a sense of 35 feet that this wave action had the impact. This is an aerial view of Banda Aceh before the devastation, and immediately afterwards, this is an aerial view of what had happened in just a twinkling of the eye. And it took a vast plain here and turned it into something that looked like rice paddies a week later. It's a little hard to see on the screen, but with the countryside just being swept away of buildings, there were on several occasions the only building that would be standing would be a mosque. Some think it was a testimony to building standards and construction for you architects and planners in the audience. Others suggest that it may have a higher intervention that was at work, but nonetheless it was a stunning view to see the mosque in the plain of devastation. There was instant reaction around the world. This is the airport in Aceh where there were just a stream of these large cargo planes coming in and out. There was the military in force helping people on the ground. I will say, apropos that airplane that you had a moment ago, that a water buffalo wandered onto the airstrip. The plane hit it, to more damage to the plane than the water buffalo, but it shut down the airport for several hours. Moving on to, in this case, Thailand, I thought this was a particularly poignant scene. It's showing a Thai military boat that is at this point a mile inland from the ocean. And the boat had guards that were protecting the grandson of the king of Thailand, who was swept away, sort of indicating that it was not just anonymous villagers, but no one was safe from the devastation that occurred. And time again, you saw areas here in Phuket where the tidal action just devastated, in this case, a resort area. There were the visions of days later, even though most of the debris had been cleaned up, bodies had been removed, there were still areas that were going to take weeks, if not months, to just sort of move the things away. There were a number of situations like this where you would have pictures posted on these makeshift bulletin boards, pictures of loved ones that people were still searching for. In some cases of bodies showing the effects of being exposed to the elements for some time, but perhaps with a distinguishing tattoo or a piece of jewelry in an effort to try and match up loved ones with people that were missing, or to identify bodies with no identification. One of the most vivid scenes for me, a little train station, this was in Sri Lanka, that I met a man who told me that he had lost 2 members of his family in a devastating effect where this train was thrown completely off the tracks and 1,200 people were killed. And you can almost see in some of the scenes there debris showing the wave of water was 11 feet high at that point. In a Buddhist monastery here, people were moving forward, providing relief efforts, distributing food, and I will say that time and time again, our experience was that the relief efforts from the governments involved, international aid agencies, including some that we have here in Oregon, like Mercy Corps and Northwest Medical Team. This is Nancy Lomberg, the president of Mercy Corps, who was with us on part of the trip, very much in evidence and doing an amazing job providing the needs that people had. These were teachers in Sri Lanka at a school. This was in a second grade class where 3 of the children were lost, but people were thankful that it was that the damage occurred on a Sunday. If it had been during the school week, perhaps most of the 1,200 children in this school would have been lost. And people were moving ahead already with the efforts to try and rebuild. This is a school site, several school sites actually in Sri Lanka, where people understood that this was an opportunity to bring people from throughout the island together to make a difference to a new start. They were recycling the materials, working in a cooperative basis. A number of students from different high schools were parts of teams to make this happen. And again, the U.S. military very much in evidence, and Oregon very much in evidence. This is a picture. Captain Chung came up to me and said he was from Corvallis, Oregon, one of any number of Oregonians that I encountered, very much in evidence and dealing with this tragedy. But I think the image that will stick with me, these 2 young men were helping with clearing the school site, and the 2 on the left had lost their parents. And you just time and time again would have these views of children coping, smiling. You wonder what's going on behind what was in their eyes. And frankly, that is the sort of point of departure for me, to what we do to do justice to these young people, to make sure that we as a country and that the developed nations around the world are following through on what is necessary to deal with devastation on this order of magnitude. I want to say, we'll just sort of, for those of you who are listening on the radio, we've stopped the slides, that the efforts by the USAID, I've mentioned Mercy Corps and Northwest Medical Teams, where millions of dollars have been generated by efforts out of Oregon. There are representatives here in the room today from corporations where the employees stepped forward, at Nike and Intel, all merged with an effort that was really unprecedented. I met with the head of the International Red Cross, who's also a member of Parliament, when we were in New Delhi, in the Indian, and they had reached all of their goals. They'd taken in all the money that they could spend in areas that were programmed. I think a word needs to be said about the United States military, because watching that steam into action with precision, with power, the ability to assess the situation, unparalleled logistic and equipment. And frankly, there was a passion on behalf of the men and women I encountered in the military to do their part to make a difference. Understanding that in the USS Lincoln, where we, of mission accomplished fame, the aircraft carrier that we staged our activities out of, they used the excess capacity to generate 80,000 gallons of fresh water a day, more than was necessary for the aircraft carrier, and they were working to shuttle that water to shore. Also, the civilian employees. I think of a couple of counselor junior officers vacationing in Phuket when the disaster hit, who understood instantly what the needs were going to be, who set up makeshift desks to try and connect Americans who were trying to find loved ones, communications with overseas, literally people working around the clock with cell phones, all on their own, freelancing, is something that I think we can all be proud of, the people who represented our country. I must also say that I was stunned with the efforts in terms of the recovery, that the second wave of death and disease that were feared because of breakdown in sewage systems and not being able to making it as sanitary as quickly as possible. It looks like this wave of loss from malaria, cholera, or whatnot is not going to occur. And in the countries that I visited, efforts at employing the people on the ground and the Mercy Corps Cash for Work program to put money instantly in the hands of people who've lost their business, lost their livelihood, to be able to put them to work making the change and circulating money in the economy was something that I think not only is so critical for relief efforts, but as I think of the United States paying foreigners in Iraq $100,000 or $150,000 a year to drive a truck when the unemployment rate in that country is 40%, and Iraqis would do that job for $200 a month, gladly. It seems like an almost obscene misallocation of resources, and I hope it's a lesson that we can apply broadly with what the United States does with its AIDS effort. Now the challenge is to make the transition from relief to recovery, working alongside these governments, the NGOs, people around the world who care. And I was frankly very, very pleased with the level of aid that has been pledged by the developed countries. The United States didn't look like we were leading the pack with the initial announcement of a $15 million aid package, but certainly what we have done on the ground and the ultimate package looks very, very solid. But the challenge here is to make sure that all of us follow through on it. Remember 7 years ago when Hurricane Mitch roared through Central America with amazing, devastating impact there. And the developed world committed some $7 billion of aid. $6.6 billion of aid was pledged. But now, 7 years later, 2/3 of it has yet to be delivered. We can't afford to have that mismatch between commitment and follow-through, either the United States or our other allies in this effort. There are other critical things that we must be doing in terms of how we engage in the relief effort. Part of it is thinking through how we are going to rebuild, not just putting people back in harm's way, but leaving those communities stronger and safer than we found them. Now there is talk, and I'm quite confident, we're going to have a tsunami warning system in the Indian Ocean. Even though tsunamis there are relatively rare, it's not going to cost that much, and it will have benefits for future tsunamis and, frankly, broader application more frequently with storms in that area. But that's a relatively minor step compared to making sure that we are strengthening the communities. One of the most fundamental things deals with education. You've heard the stories about people being fascinated when the ocean started receding as far as you could see in the horizon, and people going out and looking at the fish flopping around. I heard on several of occasions of a 9-year-old girl in Phuket who had studied tsunamis in school and was telling people, no, you're going the wrong direction. We need to go this way because the water's coming. A young lady having the presence of mind and having some fundamental knowledge resulted in saving hundreds of people. We also need to make sure that we are dealing with the location of facilities, the design, the placement, the building codes. This notion here that we're just going to rebuild the fishing village in the same vulnerable areas is something that I think we simply must avoid. This is a unique opportunity to work with these countries and the affected communities to make sure that these communities are located, built, constructed in ways that are much stronger. And it's not just the built environment. Those of you who have been listening to the series recently on NPR have heard about the impact that the natural ecosystem had on buffering those communities from the devastating effects of the tsunami. Healthy coral reefs, the mangrove along the coast, these are natural buffers. But when they have been removed to make way for coastal development, Then you had the devastation with these waves moving a half-mile or a mile inland. By restoring the natural ecosystem, we can cheaply and effectively make these communities stronger than when we found them. Finally, there is the notion of how we promote the interactions between people. I was taken by what happened in Sri Lanka, where the Tamil Tigers have been fighting the government forces for almost 2 decades, thousands of people killed, basically separated in almost an autonomous region where the Tamil Tigers have their own navy, they have their own law school. I'm told they have radar guns. It's a pretty invested in terms of a separate nature, but we found with the impact of the devastation, it brought people together, and there was cooperation between the government and the separatist forces. In Aceh, there were at least some encouraging words that there may be a possibility of the government using this as an opportunity instead of fighting the rebels in Aceh, that there may be some cooperative effort to try and heal those links. And we worked at every juncture during our trip to drive this point home as we met with officials at the highest level, both in the military and civilian, that this was an opportunity they ought not to lose. I hope that that continues to be a strong effort of United States diplomacy. At the same time, we're dealing, however, with the aftermath of this devastation, dealing with what happened in the Indian Ocean. One of my greatest concerns, and something I testified 2 weeks ago before the House International Relations Committee, that we must not allow this to be an excuse to divert our eyes from what's going on in other disasters in the world. We cannot use these resources here that are simply siphoning them away from what we should be spending in the Darfur. Our attention in areas that are in great anguish right now or will occur later in the year, it would be unforgivable if we somehow cannibalized our efforts in the aftermath of the tsunami and neglected the things that we know are going to take place in the months ahead. I must have just one additional footnote. It was not something that I expected to be spending a lot of time on in the course of this journey, but it came up at every juncture. People who were deeply concerned about the United States activities in Iraq. Whether I was talking to people in India, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, China, whether, frankly, I was talking to American business people, lower-level people in the State Department or other governmental agencies, including a number of people in the military. Without exception, people were deeply concerned about the effects of our policy in Iraq and what it has done to the United States' ability to be an effective partner in this region. And in that regard, I must confess that I am exceedingly frustrated to see that Congress may be considering our tsunami aid rolled up into a supplemental spending bill that is primarily for another $80 billion for Iraq. This is a golden opportunity for us to separate it out and spotlight what the American government, the American military, the American citizens have done to help people in this troubled area. And if somehow we step all over our message, wrap it up into an omnibus huge spending bill, most of the attention directed to Iraq, we lose a golden opportunity to be able to change a little bit that discussion in other parts of the world. I would suggest that this, however, is not just a discussion about our response to the most powerful earthquake in the last 40 years. I walk away from this experience thinking that this must be a wake-up call and an opportunity for us to learn lessons about living with nature and living with each other. not just whether the people in Sri Lanka and Indonesia can be relocated and restored, but whether we in the United States can take the lessons of the power of nature and what we should be doing and put them to work dealing with Seaside, Oregon and New Orleans. I will tell you, the first pass I took over Banda Aceh, my mind flashed to what would have happened if Hurricane Ivan had been 40 miles off course last September and hit the city of New Orleans 15 feet below sea level before the storm surges of hurricane force would have hit. Had that been the case, the images on C-SPAN would have been of thousands of people dying in New Orleans and that city being a toxic stew for months to come. These are not items that are unique to the tsunami region. They are things that we need to internalize, lessons we need to put to work in Seattle and New Orleans, and making policy in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I should mention that we are being filmed, and so anyone in the radio audience or the listening audience that would like to see the slides that Congressman Blumenauer showed, I know in Portland tonight at 8 o'clock it will be shown on CityNet Channel 30, but you can go to our website and check out the times for rebroadcast, so you'll have an opportunity to maybe spend a little more time for those of us who have seen them. We come now to our question and answer period, and I invite our members to come to the microphones in front of the room and ask Congressman Blumenauer questions, hopefully that can be asked in 30 seconds or less, and not to engage in debate. We don't have the rules set up for that. I would like to also introduce our board host today, who's Heather Kometz. She's a tax attorney with Sussman Shank, LLP. She holds a federal taxation certificate. She's been a member of the club since 1997, and she was the first co-chair of the New Leaders Council. Heather?
Thank you. My question, Congressman, is one of commitment and resources. You spoke about doing justice in the world. And in deciding how the U.S. can properly do justice in the world, I'd like to know how you in Congress weigh out the options available in your legislative quiver. For example, immediately following the tsunami, Congress worked very quickly to enact an accelerated income tax deduction for individuals making charitable contributions to tsunami relief in January, such that it would be accelerated on the first tax return. What sort of evaluation do you go through in looking at the cost value of that sort of a carrot to a public that was already immediately mobilized and caring, as compared to where we might have put those resources in recovery, where we tend to be less apt to follow through? Certainly not declining the value of what was offered, and maybe the message was more valuable than the dollars, but I'd like to know how you go through that process, because doing justice is expensive.
Heather, it's a great question, and it's one that I'm afraid Congress too often is acting reflexively. And you are absolutely right. If we were looking at the costs and consequences of an action like that, where we would, it obviously was a gesture, a symbol. It hopefully did encourage others. But as you've mentioned, we have seen an amazing outpouring of support in our community, around the country, and around the world. And it was for immediate relief as opposed to recovery. And I would amend that to suggest that it's not just recovery that we should be investing in now, but prevention. We could have saved, it's estimated, $280 billion in disaster costs in the 1990s if we had invested $40 billion up front, about a 7-to-1 return on investment, which I think most people would suggest is very impressive in dollar terms. But more important than the dollar terms, there would have been countless lives saved and suffering avoided. So I'm hopeful that we can do a better job perhaps of the analysis and not doing something that's largely symbolic, but that we are doing the hard work of working with people in making sure that recovery is done right, and that somewhere in there will be an investment in prevention so that we're all better off.
Tamsin Wassell, City Club member. I actually am having a, I understand what they've had to do over the last 60 days in terms of recovery, of recovering bodies, of picking up the debris. But I don't really understand what it will take to do recovery. What are the benchmarks? How will we know that they're making the progress that needs to be made, and obviously that the resources are there, but what are the steps that we have to expect now?
This is an area that I'm hopeful that we can engage government officials, and I mentioned earlier, I've mentioned 4 or 5 times, the tremendous contributions that have taken place in the non-governmental arena to be able to do these efforts properly. I fear that in one sense, a lot of what people do is the rush to relief. There is not the longer-term perspective of what's going to leave people better off. And it's not just putting, say, a village back in an area that it's going to be inherently susceptible, not just to a tsunami once every 200 years, but to tropical storms on a regular basis. I am concerned of the talk that I heard about instantly coming back and dealing with the subsistence fisheries. Now, many of these villagers were in harm's way because they make their living fishing. And they lost their boats, they lost their nets. But I hope, and we've tried to have these conversations, and they're difficult to work through, but in the Indian Ocean right now, we have too many people chasing too few fish, and we risk ultimately the collapse of fisheries. If this were a time, and one doesn't want to sound callous, but if this were a time to be able to help encourage some people who may want a different type of livelihood, who wanted to voluntarily be bought out, or to negotiate agreements with some of the more wealthy countries to restrict some of their commercial harvesting of the ocean, the exploitation that is frankly doing a lot more damage than the subsistence farmers, that we could work something out in a way that would be better ecologically, leave these people as strong or stronger economically, and not be in a position where we just equip them to further deplete the fishing stocks faster until it collapses. This is an area that I think we're making progress. I think there are people that understand it. A lot of these decisions are very, very hard. Some of you may have seen the article in the New York Times today that talked about billions of dollars spent on a remote little island to fortify it in Japan against a tsunami, when there would have been, which dwarfed the total investment that Japan made in helping the recovery throughout the Asian basin by a ratio of 7-to-1. So there are some real hard questions, perhaps going back to Heather's initial point about how we prioritize and strategically implement it. But I will say easier said than done when you look a poor fisherman in the eye.
Congressman Mark Anderson, member. I'd like to bring us back home and talk again about not just the tragic choices we make about addressing problems after they've occurred rather than trying to prevent them, but in directing our resources in a better way. I just came back from Bangkok myself, and there seems to be a great ambivalence There's wonderful resources, an embarrassment of riches, but none of it's going where it needs to go efficiently and effectively, but for the Mercy Corps and other more focused groups. And we have some levers, at least on United States-based nonprofit entities. One is the tax code that's already been referred to. The second one is the Federal Trade Commission and false advertising. There are plenty of groups collecting money for these efforts, and that money never goes to Southeast Asia. Some only 5–10% might trickle down someplace. Are there any efforts at all in the legislature to address some of those concerns about making sure that money goes where people intend it to go?
I think that's a terrific point. First and foremost, of course, people just need to know who they're doing business with and go with a proven commodity. And there are websites available that explain what people are doing, that look at the fundraising expenses, the expense ratio. Some of it goes, frankly, beyond that in terms of individual action. I was at the International Airport here in Portland wishing a bon voyage to the group that Show DeZono was a part of here, that had Oregonians visiting Thailand and doing something personally themselves. There are decisions we can make as consumers. There are decisions we make as contributors. I think we probably don't do as much as we should legislatively in terms of consumer protection, but I would say there are a number of areas that we're not providing the consumer protection probably we should as a government. But I think the best protection at this point is to know who we're working with, and luckily we've got lots of good examples here that we can have confidence that they know what they're doing. But I take your point, and I wish I had more positive a report about what we were doing. But in terms of cost effectiveness, I'm not certain that's the best way for us to be spending our time right now, as opposed to other areas, to make sure that we follow through and we do it right.
Paddy Tillett, member. Maybe it's my pager. Paddy Tillett, member, unbuzzed. You began to talk about learning lessons from what happened here at home. And I know some years ago you went to some length to try and persuade those who built in floodways to remove themselves somewhere else through the flood insurance policy. And it was evident at that time that there were an awful lot of deaf ears around, that somehow flood insurance should just keep paying and people can keep rebuilding in these dangerous places. Have you seen a change in that attitude? Have you seen changes that will enable us to be more intelligent about how we redevelop our properties?
In 6 years, people in my office and I worked to stop the federal government from subsidizing people who lived where God repeatedly showed that they weren't wanted. In some places they called it carpet insurance. 1% of the properties were responsible for 30% of the flood insurance losses, which the rest of America paid for by increased flood insurance premiums. And that was and is a battle. We got the legislation passed, but now the administration doesn't want to administer it for some reason. It's just, it is extraordinarily frustrating. But I don't want to say that it is, I would hesitate to say that it is, that people aren't smart enough. I think it's that we as Americans are often conditioned to think in different ways, and I think it is very cultural. You know, in the United States, when we have some horrible fire, some guy falls asleep smoking in bed, and his children die, and maybe a neighbor's house is burned. In the United States, we just rush in, you know, we establish a fund for them, we bring them blankets. If you did that in Japan, they'd put you in jail. And I'm not saying that if you abuse, they have very strict liability for individual responsibility. And we tend to identify with people who are in fact victims. And I don't think that's necessarily wrong, but we need to sort of reposition to understand that we're not doing a favor for that widow to continue to live in the floodplain repeatedly flooded out, because I've been collecting these examples where the widow actually died trying to save her son in a flooded situation, or people trapped in underground garages. I mean, it goes on and on in terms of people put themselves and others at risk. We need to look at this notion of how we live more appropriately with nature, and how we're not doing people favors by having the wrong governmental signals. And it is, but I do think it's profoundly an American characteristic that we're quick to respond, mostly with relief. We're terrible on recovery and follow through, and we're slow to learn some of these other lessons. Look at what's going on in Southern California right now. This is the same story over and over again. And I clipped all the stuff from the LA wildfires and the devastation in San Diego County from a year and a half ago. And then the next wave of stories were people moving right back there because that's where they'd raised the kids. And we are, at times, real slow learners.
Hi, Leslie Hildula, member. I'm concerned about the continuing cost of the war in Iraq, year after year, millions and billions of dollars, and I wanted to know if you could address the impact of that spending in Iraq on our ability to do good work elsewhere in the world.
We are approaching $300 billion in Iraq with no end in sight for the foreseeable future, upwards of $5 billion a week. A month, rather. No. A week? I get confused. I just get overwhelmed, I must say. And when you're voting, you usually are so convinced that we're spending too much on the wrong things done by the wrong people. I sometimes get a little fuzzy, and I apologize. But I'm certain about the $82 billion that they want. And I am certain that the spending continues, and it does have consequences. If we had been spending less of that money in Iraq, and we had spent more of that money in Afghanistan to stabilize, to increase the security footprint, to allow the NGOs to do more there, I think we wouldn't have the emergence of a narco state. We wouldn't have Iraq now is a hotbed of terrorism. I find that interesting, the administration now admitting that, where they weren't before. And we are shortchanging investments that would build friends and, frankly, deal with stabilizing troubled areas around the world. Before 9/11, the CIA identified urban instability, the teeming mega cities, Karachi, Jakarta, as areas that were actually threats to United States security because of the social unrest, because of the political and economic upheaval, and the environmental problems. Our total spending for USAID for the problems to help those troubled cities around the world is less than 2 cruise missiles. And I think it's a foolish misallocation where there's so much that we could do. And the point I made earlier, if we would adopt the model that, for example, Mercy Corps had used with the Cash for Food, doing that in Iraq, we could save billions of dollars to the Halliburtons of this world and be able to accelerate the rebuilding and healing of that fractured country.
Hi, Karen Essler, City Club member. Is the money that's being allocated for tsunami relief in the form of cash, or is any of it constituted by U.S. corporations, contractors going there to work?
Often there are elements of United States aid that is tied into the use of American products and American services. I haven't seen the breakout in this specific program yet. I've been trying to get it separated, as I say, from the larger roll-up with the Iraqi supplemental. But this is something that we routinely do with a lot of our aid, that it is involved with United States products and United States companies to try and leverage it. This is something that's not unique to the United States. The Japanese, the Germans often condition their economic and military assistance tied into the products of that country.
Guinevere Milius, City Club member. I was curious, I'm not sure that you had a chance to listen to Peter Courtney's talk last week. He spoke about the possible effects of tsunami and earthquakes in Oregon. As you probably know, we're due for a big earthquake according to seismologists. And of course, we are the benefactors of a good tsunami warning system, but it doesn't do anything for us. You know, once the tsunami's rolled through, if everyone's cleared out of town, there'll still be devastation. Plus, as we know from the December 26th tsunami, an earthquake still shook a lot of those buildings down before the wave hit in Indonesia. Senator Courtney told us that pretty much every school in Oregon is at risk if an earthquake were to strike. Is there anything we're doing on the congressional level with all these billions of dollars being spent on a questionable war? Is there anything we're doing on the congressional level to address prevention in the case of government buildings?
One of my highest priorities in terms of infrastructure investment and planning and organization is for us to be more mindful of preparation for disaster in terms, and it's not just earthquakes, it's forest fires, it's drought, it's landslides, hurricane force gales. Our basic approach to disaster preparedness in this country is a disaster. I mentioned the situation in New Orleans. We have coastal communities in the southeast where after hurricanes, federal money is used to put development back on coastal spits where it's certain to be subjected in the foreseeable future to another pounding from a hurricane. We have a conflict between our land use, forest policies, the use of water. A friend of mine, a gentleman named Roger Kennedy, is doing some great mappings of what he calls the flame zone that talks about the areas of increasing persistent drought in the United States, not just in the West, but in the Southeast as well, and overlay that with areas of forest fires. And we are putting millions of people more at risk every year, sprawling into this area, which is going to increase the cost. I mean, the cost of forest fires is largely driven by how many people live up in these areas and expect almost urban-level services. If it were an area where you could allow the fires to burn, and you weren't dealing with trying to save this cabin and this vacation home and this little cluster, you would cut the cost of forest fires about 20 times. So there are a range of things we should be doing in terms of what our policies are going to be for everything from hurricanes, earthquakes, forest fires, a little bit of prevention, a little bit of planning, a little bit of common sense would pay huge dividends in tax dollars and lives saved. As it relates to schools, I am hopeful that there will be a time in yet this decade, instead of proposing cutting educational budgets, that we actually are providing some federal help for education to modernize schools. And each of those modernized schools should be, have a seismic retrofit so that we make them a place where children can go to be safe, not a place that they need to run away from.
Carla Kelly, City Club member. Aside from the comparisons of which country gave how much money, what reactions did you get from people you talked to in the relief effort to the American generosity and the relief effort that we were doing there, in contrast to the way that they're feeling about America given the war in Iraq? How do people reconcile these things, and is it possible for any relief effort to get past the atmosphere that's been created in the last year and a half?
It's a great question and something we concentrated on, and what my experience has been traveling in these countries, talking to people individually as well in an official capacity, is that in the main, while our government leadership is losing a popularity contest with Osama bin Laden, as stunning as that is to comprehend, that most people still have positive feelings towards Americans. I think what happened in terms of the outpouring of aid and support reinforced some positive feelings that people have. And I think that particularly in these Asian countries, there's an opportunity to build on it. And it's why I like the person-to-person contact that we've seen, the Oregon face that I referenced in terms of non-governmental organizations and companies, and the flight of Oregonians to visit Thailand. These are things that build on the person-to-person relationship. We're all in this together. And we're not going to be able to turn our backs on issues of a global economy, global warming, the struggle against terrorism. People tend to understand that we're in this together. I think people are more realistic overseas about the opportunities and the limitations. I'm hopeful that we can continue to build on the foundation which many of you in this room are a part of, because of the groups that you support and what you do personally, that we can build on that, because that's the type of person-to-person diplomacy that ultimately is going to forge a stronger band, frankly, than some of our missteps at the diplomatic and military level. But I come back from this experience being profoundly impressed about the opportunities, very respectful of the steps that people took, and optimistic that there are enough people who get it that we're going to be able to take advantage of this and leave the world a little better off. Thank you very much.
Well, it was a very positive ending, and I think we all feel a little bit better about it. And thank you so much, Congressman Blumenauer. It's good to see you again. It's been a while. And we are adjourned.